Welcome to the Fabric Spotlight series. This is a series of talks we held with investors and entrepreneurs on topics as varied from cloud infrastructure to AI to other different topics. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Shirish Sathaye, who is the senior partner at Cervin Ventures. Welcome, Shirish.
Thank you.
Shirish, you and I have known each other for a long time.
That is correct.
I still remember visiting you at Altion Web Systems. You may not remember, but I do remember.
I remember it well.
So it has been a long journey. So would love to hear. I know Altion Web Systems is amazingly successful, but would love to hear how you got to Altion and from there to where you are now.
Well, Altion was a long time ago. Altion was, I joined in 1997, and when there were 20 people in the company, I was the head of engineering and chief technology officer. And in the short span of 4 years, we grew to 700 people, went public, and then got acquired for several $1 billion. And I think we met in that context.
Yes.
And after Altion, the investors in Altion, one of the investors was Matrix Partners, and I got to know people who later on became my partners at Matrix quite well, and they asked me to join the partnership in mid-2001, just before 9/11. And then, of course, 9/11 happened. I had not made any investments, and my office was eerily empty. And nobody would come to see me, and I was sitting in the office by myself with no investments. Luckily, I made my first investment with people I knew, and that company turned to be Aruba Networks. And I always say better to be lucky than smart with your first investment. And the two founders of Aruba were people I knew from before, and so I stayed on their board for 9 or 10 years, and the company went public, and I ended up staying at Matrix Partners for all of 10 years, and after the financial crisis of 2008, I left Matrix and joined Khosla Ventures, and at Khosla Ventures, I stayed for 3 years, made my best investment so far in a company called Nutanix, and then after leaving Khosla, I spent some time at Formation 8, and now I'm at Cervin Ventures. So I've been in the venture business for about 19 years, but prior to that, I was an operating guy for 15 years at a couple of different startups. Altion Web Systems, of course, and then 4 Systems. Many people may not remember it, ATM switch company.
Yes.
So I've been lucky with my startups, I guess, the ones I worked at. And then I have a technical background, an engineering degree from IIT in India, and a PhD from Carnegie Mellon.
Well, it speaks to your success that you could call it lucky or having insight into what happens. And interestingly enough, I noticed that you have an infrastructure focus. Is that the focus that you are now bringing into Cervin? And if you can talk a little bit about Cervin and
Sure.
your particular focus also.
Sure. So Cervin is a $100 million fund, and we call ourselves an early stage fund, but we really like to be the first institutional money in a company. If a company has raised a couple of $1 million from angels and maybe a seed fund, we are fine with looking at that company and investing in it. But if a company has raised, say, $10 million or more, then that's way beyond what we like to do. We only invest in enterprise companies, and we like to focus on software, but we don't restrict ourselves to software. So, and within that broad focus, our areas are infrastructure, functional and industry SaaS, data and analytics, and DevOps and IT tools. And then we have 2 other areas of focus that are significant areas for us, and which are somewhat different from what you see today. One is retail transformation. We believe the retail industry is going through tremendous transformations in both good and bad ways, and I think there are great investments to be made there. And also, we have made a particular practice in 5G. Because I think 5G, we can talk more about 5G, but 5G is going to be game-changing for us. So those are our broad areas of focus at Cervin. And I'm the infrastructure guy, as you correctly point out.
Wonderful. The venture capital business has changed especially in the recent past. How do you see the venture capital landscape? Where does Cervin fit in? Where do you see the Fabric fit into that? And how do you see the landscape changing and evolving?
Yeah, it has changed a lot, and it continues to change. I think there's a few reasons for it. I think one of the main reasons is that unlike when I started in the business, where you could not build a real company with less than $10 million, at least 7 or 8, Today, you can actually get some meaningful start of a product market fit with $2 or $3 million. And that has opened up a whole bunch of opportunities. And so as a result, the venture funds have actually become bimodally distributed. You have very small funds, $100 million or less, and then you have the mega funds, right? And so because you can actually show, interestingly, enough value with $3 or $4 million of investment, there's an opportunity for funds like Cervin to actually make an impact. And so although we call them seed, in the old days we used to call it Series A. I always invested as the first institutional investor or close to the first institutional investor in companies. We used to call it A, now we call it seed.
Interesting. You are the infrastructure person. The infrastructure landscape also changed quite a bit, just like the VC landscape has. So could you talk about what you define as infrastructure from your perspective, and also what are the trends in that space?
Sure. So back in the day, infrastructure meant hardware, right? You
Yes.
built boxes, you built computers, you built networking devices, you built something else, and you sold boxes, right? Today, most infrastructure companies are software companies. And the reason infrastructure as a practice has changed is because the ecosystem around us has changed. Because of the advent of public cloud and mobile, you can now build companies that are software-only infrastructure companies, and we have several of them in our portfolio. Now, there is a place for hardware, of course, but you can make so much of an impact by just developing software companies that take advantage of the hardware you can rent from the public cloud providers, that there's great opportunity there.
Okay. So in that context of software infrastructure plays, how do you see IoT coming up? I know that it is an area both fraught with difficulties as well as a lot of opportunities.
Sure.
And you have had some personal experience in that space, but how do you see that market evolving?
Sure. So IoT is, I would say, a broad market, and essentially what's going to happen is, and it's already happening, that the number of IP connected devices in the world is going to increase by an order of magnitude. And most of these devices have no displays. They're not computers in the traditional sense of the word, but they are devices. They're sensors, they're actuators, and so forth. So as a result, those devices have to be controlled. They have software stacks that are not as sophisticated and many times not as current as what we have been used to in the traditional computing world. So they are, by their very nature, less secure. And because they don't have, in many cases, traditional operating systems, you need to come up with new techniques to secure them. And therein lies the opportunity. So there have been several investments by investors in the past, and there will be more in the future. For example, the company Armis was just taken private for over $1 billion. Before Cervin, I had made an investment in a company called Nyansa that was just acquired by VMware. So there will be more opportunity in this space.
Now, in terms of when you said software and how software infrastructure is evolving, the Fabric itself was founded on that thesis. Sure. In fact, if you see the very first Fabric slides, you will see the hardware and the middle layer, which is infrastructure software, where we played. You have observed the Fabric. We have talked a few times. Sure. How do you see Fabric, from your perspective, playing into this ecosystem, and where do you think we should also be looking at?
Sure. So I think Fabric has a very important place. And as I'm sure you know, and this is probably the reason you started Fabric, we have never talked about why you did, but I think the reason you started Fabric is that you realized, and I realized, that to build a company is like a recipe. You need good management, you need good technology, you need good product market fit, you need a bunch of different things to all work together. And many times entrepreneurs know some parts of it well. By your strategy of working with the entrepreneurs early on and becoming pseudo co-founders of the company, you can add other parts of the recipe before other investors like us look at it. So it's, to me, it's a goodness, because I see a more complete company before I invest in it. So I encourage you to keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you. Associated with all of this, infrastructure, as you mentioned, infrastructure software even, is a broad term. There are various components to that. One component of that is security.
Sure.
How do you see security in the context of cloud and infrastructure, and how do you see that evolving?
Sure. So there's been a tremendous amount of innovation in security in the cloud or in the data center, I would say. And when I say data center, I really mean the public cloud data center and the enterprise data center, but it's largely moving to the public cloud. And that security has been in a bunch of different areas. There is significant investment in data governance, privacy, access control, anonymization, single sign-on, authorization, and so forth. But there's yet more to be done because the underlying software keeps changing and the sensitivity of the data keeps going up. If you think about it, the biggest fear that large companies have about the public cloud is security. They don't want to put your social security number up in the public cloud for it to get hacked and then it appearing on the front page of the Wall Street Journal that that company got hacked. So these companies will buy best of breed products, not necessarily from the incumbents. And therein lies the opportunity for us. For example, we have invested in a company that does data governance and privacy and access control in the public cloud. And that company, after having raised just $4 million to my previous point, has now 14 customers and 5 million in ARR already. So that therein lies the opportunity. That unlike many other areas, large enterprises don't wait for incumbents to innovate when they innovate, when they buy for security reasons, because fear is a great driver and they buy best of breed.
Fantastic. Now, staying within the security framework, the world is going towards distributed services. Most of it, I suppose, many of it is Kubernetes based. How do you see the trend? Kubernetes, security in the context of Kubernetes, or anything else in the context of a distributed services world?
Absolutely. Microservices and distributed services is a big area, and Kubernetes has several security issues that need to be addressed, and they are largely unaddressed. I have actually seen several companies in that space. However, there is a problem. The problem is, anytime you make an investment in the public cloud, you need to make sure that the public cloud providers themselves are not going to solve the problem. And in some cases, at least in the case of Kubernetes security, it is entirely possible that AKS, which is the Azure Kubernetes services and Amazon's Kubernetes services, might solve the problem. So I am sort of waiting to figure out how it all shakes out before investing. But I've seen several opportunities in that space.
How do you see the rate of adoption of Kubernetes? Do you see this picking up? Because from personal experience, what we have seen is sort of production, scale production, we have not yet observed large scale, but how do you see that?
That is correct. That is correct. I think if you take a step back and look at where Kubernetes is applicable, it is applicable in the areas where people want multi-cloud services. If you want to stay within a single public cloud provider, they have their own native applications that you can use. You don't need to use Kubernetes. Now, although they have also started offering Kubernetes, but that's in response to customers asking for it. But for the most part, they have their own offerings. So you don't need Kubernetes. But if you want to take your applications and have the flexibility to move between clouds, then having a non-proprietary container management service is important. And that default non-proprietary container management service is Kubernetes. But you're right, we have not seen customers deploy in production something that allows them to go between clouds when they want to. But it might happen. We don't know yet.
Okay. Actually, coming back to the earlier topic of IoT, we have also seen, as you, in our earlier discussions, informal discussions about edge, about 5G services, IoT, these are all a continuum of things. Sure. Just share us with your thoughts in all of these areas, from 5G to edge to any of them.
So as far as IoT market, if you look at the industry vertical where the number of IoT devices per square foot is the highest, it is healthcare. So in hospitals, you have many IoT devices per square foot, and they are all expensive. So they need to, and they could kill people. So I think having them secure is super important. Whether it's an MRI machine, an insulin pump, any of those things, they're all these days internet connected for various reasons, and so they need to be secured. So I think that's an area where several companies have started innovating, but that area is still an unsolved problem, I believe. So that's one area. As far as edge computing goes, which is your other question, I think edge computing is coming back in a big way. The pendulum, as you know, always swings back and forth. It used to be client server, it used to be all mainframes and so forth. But now we are going to have a combination of edge computing and then public clouds. And the reason is very simple. The amount of data being generated at the edge is so large that you cannot send that data up to the cloud even with the fastest 5G network. So you have to aggregate that data. You have to do some computing at the edge and then take the summary of that computation and send it to the public cloud for further analysis. And that's, I think, the main driver for edge. Which brings me to 5G, which is, as I said earlier, is a big major focus for Cervin. And I think it's time to take a step back about 5G. If you think about it, we could not imagine the applications that 3G and 4G could make possible. If I told you about 3G, you would have not been able to predict that Uber will happen, right? Just like that, with 5G, you and I sitting here cannot predict what new applications will be possible. But I think a whole world of applications is going to open. We can all predict AR and VR, yes, but there are many other things that will happen, which I'm sure will happen, that we don't know. So therein lies the opportunity for us. So we'll invest in 5G infrastructure, and we have already invested in 5G infrastructure, but we will also invest in 5G applications and 5G underlying software infrastructure to make those applications possible.
Staying with 5G infrastructure, and in that context also software-defined WAN, which is also part of all of this infrastructure play, how do you see the landscape even within the infrastructure space, software-defined WAN space? As you know, our first claim to fame was VeloCloud at the Fabric when we came up with the SD-WAN.
Big
one of the
great
first
investment.
Thank you. And how do you see the landscape evolving in that space?
Actually, that's an area where I was definite point of view. So SD-WAN was a great success. There were several companies in addition to VeloCloud, although VeloCloud was actually one of the early ones. But what did SD-WAN do? Essentially, SD-WAN, you know this better than I do, connected the data center to branch offices using not MPLS links, which are expensive, but using the internet. That was a great idea. However, the underlying network architecture has changed. The data center has moved to the cloud. So SD-WAN needs to transform also. So now what used to be the data center is the public cloud, and what used to be other branch offices are other regions of the public cloud or other clouds. So a new class of company is being created where the core of the network is in the public cloud, and the branches, if you will, are either your actual branches or other public clouds or other regions of the public cloud. And actually I have an investment in that area called Aviatrix, which is doing exactly that. But there will be other companies.
Wonderful. With your background in being both an entrepreneur, being part of startups, now as an investor, what is your parting advice to entrepreneurs? Your thoughts, are there still opportunities for entrepreneurs in the infrastructure space? How, and anything else that you would like to share with the audience?
Sure. Yeah, so I think I said earlier that I've been lucky with my startups, right? And I think at that time, of course, I didn't know what I was doing, so I really got lucky. But then I thought about why I was lucky. And I realized that the decisions I made when I joined those companies had only to do with the people. So when I went and interviewed at one of these companies, if I loved the people, and I thought they were A+ people, not necessarily the nicest people in the world, but high quality people I'd love to work with, then I just joined them without thinking too much about it. My investment style is similar. If I think these people are game changers, then they will do great. So for a young entrepreneur or a first-time entrepreneur, I say build a team around you that complements you of A+ people. And if that happens, then everything else takes care of itself. So I always tell my first-time CEOs the following. I'll say that you need to hire a team around you so that you should have nothing to do. And they always start smiling at that. Of course, I'm overstating it. What I mean by that is you need to get out of firefighting mode, right? You should have your team do the firefighting for you so that you can think strategically and decide what's in the long-term interest of the company. That's my first advice about people. And second, when it comes to running the company, do not increase your burn rate until you have product market fit. Because today, as I said earlier, with $2, $3, $4 million, you can achieve reasonable product market fit. It may not be perfect, but at least you know some people are biting at it.
A little bit, the last thing which we cannot avoid, given the changed nature of what you've seen, the coronavirus and impact on other things, how do you see investors making decisions? You and I have been through various things. We were 9/11, and then prior to that, we have had the recessions in 92, 93. How do you see the present situation?
I think the present situation is a little bit different from the previous ones. I think the previous ones were situations that we actually understood better. We understand a natural disaster. We at least understand, we may not understand the reasons, but we understand what happened in the terrorist attack like 9/11. Here we don't actually understand. We don't know the extent, the breadth and depth of what's going on here. So the only advice I have to my companies is that be prudent. Don't panic, be prudent, but if you want to increase your burn rate significantly, be twice as prudent as you normally would. And then be ready to react to a fast-changing situation. I think this will all become clearer, much clearer in the next 60 days. So the next 60 days, take a pause and see how this develops.
Thank you very much, Shirish, and thanks everyone for watching, and stay tuned for the next speaker in the Spotlight series.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.